Today, I want to talk about natural monopoly, and a natural monopoly is when it's natural for only one firm to produce because they can produce at the lowest cost, and economies of scale make it impractical for smaller firms to enter because there's already one main firm that can produce at the lowest possible cost. So we're going to start by drawing this graph like this. It's just like it's like a normal monopoly graph. Typically, just a typical monopoly graph. You have your demand and your marginal revenue is lower. But this is where it gets different. We will see that our marginal cost is constantly decreasing, and that would mean that our average total cost would also be decreasing the entire time because marginal cost never exceeds average total cost, meaning the average total cost decreases. And this also further proves the point that a natural monopoly is when the firm can produce at the lowest possible cost. Okay, so there are three main things to focus on with a natural monopoly. There is the unregulated quantity, there is a fair return quantity, and there is a socially optimal quantity. The socially optimal quantity will determine whether or not it is a natural monopoly, but we'll get into that later. First, we'll talk about unregulated, which is something that we all know how to do, and this graph shouldn't throw you off. So it is where MR equals MC, and the unregulated price and quantity would be here, and you can dot for the quantity and price of the unregulated, and I'm just going to write here unregulated. Next, we have fair return, and that is just where we have a normal economic profit or a zero economic profit. Some of you might know it as, but we know what that is. That is just where price equals ATC. The graph shouldn't throw you off. Price is demand, and ATC is right here, and where they're equal is right here, and that is fair return. And if you just think about it, the total revenue and total price is equal. So there you have zero economic profit. And finally, we have socially optimal. This is where price equals marginal cost and it is allocatively efficient. And we see where that happens right here. You can see marginal cost equals price, and marginal cost is also known as a supply curve. So that's easier to remember. And you get P, Q here, and I'm going to write out to the side over here, socially optimal. But there are some things I want to touch on here. We know how to graph these, we know how to find the quantity and prices for each of these points, but I want to talk about consumer surplus and deadweight loss. As we know, there is no deadweight loss. I mean, it's socially optimal. There is consumer surplus, of course, but there is no deadweight loss. But in this graph, it kind of looks a little wonky. So in an unregulated market, you can see that there is deadweight loss and there is consumer surplus. Mainly right here is deadweight loss, and right here is consumer surplus. Now, if I return, I'm going to use a different color here, but you can see we remember that it is zero economic profit. This is a pretty good medium between an unregulated market and a socially optimal market for the firm itself. But remember that there is still deadweight loss here. So there is consumer surplus here because that's where the price is. We see that price right there. But there is still deadweight loss because this is not socially optimal yet. And that would be right there. You can see that quantity is coming down, and that leaves some people out of the market still. Now, when it is socially optimal, we finally have no deadweight loss, and we have the maximum potential of consumer surplus. But it is important to note that this may sound good for the consumers. It is not for the firm itself. The firm is actually producing at a loss, which they don't want to do. So the only time, most of the time, whenever they produce at socially optimal, they're usually being subsidized by the government, which is how governments regulate monopolies. And that is everything I wanted to cover with this lesson on natural monopoly. It's pretty simple and straightforward. You just got to make sure you don't get caught up on things that sound good or look right, but in reality aren't.